So let's talk through positives and pitfalls of one of the easiest ways to get an edge over the opponent's army in Warhammer 40k, with a full discussion of using reserves. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking reserve tactics in Warhammer 40k, talking through the basics of committing your armies from off the battlefield and a few tactics as to how to use them to best effect. To start off, let's recap the basic reserve rules. In general, when you've got an army in Warhammer 40k, you can declare to have a certain number of reserve units, and this one's done at the declare battle formation step. They don't count as deployment drops as they used to in the past. So basically you and your opponent will have to nominate a certain amount of models to start off the board if you want to. And these ones can either be declared to be in strategic reserve or deep strike under normal circumstances. Typically when they come onto the board, they can usually only arrive Battle Round 2 and Battle Round 3 in most mission packs. Both the Leviathan and the Pariah Nexus mission packs only allowed units to come on those turns, and that's certainly a big source of confusion for newer players. It's just a bit weird having the reserve rules sort of divided around 3 different sections. That same restriction doesn't apply to units that started on the board and might have returned to reserves in some way, such as a stratagem to put them back in reserve, or a datasheet ability such as the Calidus Assassin. When they arrive onto the board, they typically have to set up at least 9 inches horizontally from enemy units, which means that the opponent can try and screen them out, and any charges are going to be a little bit unlikely unless you've got good things to boost them. And when they arrive, they're set up on the board, so the opponent might be able to do certain reactive things such as overwatch to them, and that could be a big deal for certain units with a lot of that kind of threat. Then beyond that, there's a few restrictions as to how many units you can put in reserve and where they can turn up for certain types of them. In the Pariah Nexus mission pack, you're only allowed to put 50% of your points total into reserve, and also only half of the amount of units that you have just in terms of raw datasheet count, and those apply to all reserves, deep strike plus strategic reserves. It means that you can't just completely null deploy your opponent and put nothing on the board should it make sense to for some reason. Deep strike tends to be the least restrictive form of reserves. Beyond the 9-inch thing, the turn drops, and the amount of units that you set up, their units can basically turn up anywhere. But strategic reserves has a few more restrictions. You can only put 1/4 of your army in strategic reserve, so that'd be things without the deep strike keyword, I guess. And then as normal, they won't be able to arrive turn 1. Turn 2, they can arrive within 6 inches of any board edge, but may not set up within the enemy deployment zone. And then in turn 3, it's anywhere that's 6 inches from the edges of the board, including the enemy's deployment zone. Finally, if a unit gets returned to strategic reserve via one of those datasheet abilities, they can use the deep strike rule to deploy anywhere on the board with it, if they happen to have it. Basically, the 6 inches from the board edge thing only applies to units that don't get deep strike. I feel like when you get used to the system, it becomes fairly intuitive, though I must admit, there's a fair few technicalities that can be kind of forgettable as a newer player. For reserves tactics, probably the first thing I'd say is that most armies, I think, typically do profit from having at least some units in reserve, whether it's strategic reserve coming in from the board edges or deep strikers. At least in the majority of average games of Warhammer 40k, I think the utility of having one unit in reserves has a lot of value in itself. There's just a bunch of things that if you have one unit on, then you might get slightly diminishing returns on if you went for more, even if plenty of armies can very happily put loads of units in reserve if they want to. The most obvious advantage of reserves is basically getting a damage alpha strike on the opponent. Basically your unit teleports in or comes in from the board edge and then gets to have a big round of shooting against the opponent before they get any chance to attack you. And that can be quite a big deal in Warhammer 40k. Getting to attack before the opponent is usually a recipe for success. It's maybe particularly helpful for close range damage dealers, particularly shooting units that want to be within 12 inches. Say maybe Militarum Tempestus Scions dropping in and firing loads of plasma guns and melter guns all over the opponent, or perhaps some Chaos Knight War Dog Brigands turning up on the flanks and getting the first bout of fire against the enemy, when turn 2 might have been the earliest they were going to be firing anyway if the opponent has hidden a good chunk of their army turn 1. On top of that, it also forces your opponent to screen if they might not otherwise bother, and that can have some advantage with the opponent having to think about spreading things out, which might allow you to get lines of sight that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, or keep some units back that should ideally have been getting stuck into the fight. Rapid Ingress is a massively powerful stratagem which can potentially easily get you into melee, and having the option to be able to threaten that is quite good. Reserves are really handy for doing positional secondaries on turn 2 and turn 3, like say behind enemy lines, engaged on all fronts, or ones where you have to get to the board edges. Having a cheap reserve unit or two can be really good for that, and otherwise from a more damage and defense point of view, it can maybe just help overwhelm certain areas of the board, maybe adding an extra batch of forces to a place where the fight's turning out to be kind of close and tipping the balance in your favour. or maybe striking out on their own against a very lightly defended section of the board where they might, say, be able to destroy an isolated objective grabber and then remain safe from the rest of the enemy army in return. Between all that, I think in most armies, most of the time, it often makes sense to have at least one reserve unit, and you can use more, though I feel like several armies might want to have a bunch of units that they might consider putting into reserve, and potentially varying that a little bit depending on the opponent. Probably the single biggest one are big board control armies, forces that might be able to spread out and basically deny you any good locations to drop. Say if you're fighting a massive horde force where they just keep on pushing units down the edge of the board, and they've got more than enough to carpet their home field in bodies, you might well, say, put a big scary unit in reserve with a plan to drop it and take something out important in the midst of their army or threaten objectives, but then realise that you've got literally nowhere to deploy it besides basically back in your own deployment zone. And usually if that's the case, you were probably better off just putting it on the board in the first place, as at least then you'd have a better chance of getting a charge that's closer than 9 inches if the opponent's screening out that far. Often it might make sense to just march a whole bunch of units up the board behind terrain, if you do think the opponent's got the power to screen out a ton of board space from you. Maybe just to underline the entire screening thing, maybe taking a look at these scouts can potentially just underline just how much one unit can screen out from deep strike if they want to. Maximally strung out, each of these scouts can be 2 inches from each other, and then each one of those creates a 9-inch circle on the board. End to end, the unit could screen out 31 inches worth of drop zone, with over 18 inches diameter across much of that. It does mean the squad might be breaking cover and you might be able to get lines of sight to them, but that's often not the single biggest deal in the world for chaff grunts in the home field, and particularly not if it stops you deep striking some scary terminators behind enemy lines. It might depend a little bit on the experience of the opponent, but people who know what they're doing with screening can often make reserves into a much riskier thing to commit to in a big way. In any case, when reserves get to the board, often positioning is just going to be kind of basic, dictated by where they can physically fit, if the opponent's left a gap for them that's big enough to put them in. If they want to be dealing damage to something big and important to the opponent's army, they might need line of sight to that, or the chance to make a charge on them. And if they're going to be small interference units dropping to do secondary objectives and things, then it's going to be the positioning of where they need to be to do them, whether they have to tow into a terrain piece, drop somewhere safe to survive the enemy counter-attack, or get within the enemy deployment zone. Beyond that though, I feel like there's all sorts of nice to have type things that if you could manage them at the same time, then that'd be good. Getting a cover save definitely isn't the worst thing in the world to try and defend against the inevitable strike back, or potentially if you've got a unit that's out on the flanks or something, maybe being behind a line of sight blocking terrain piece will be handy if you don't need line of sight yourself. If all things are equal and you can spread out a little bit to tow onto an objective, that could be nice, perhaps particularly if you're making a risky charge after that. If the charge fails, then at least the unit's still important because it'll be sat on an objective getting you points, and if you are delivering either shooting or melee damage, potentially having multiple targets within range could be an okay idea. Say for example, what if one of your other shooting units just unexpectedly overperforms and destroys your primary target, then you'd have something else to go after. If you do have multiple locations to consider as well as the impact that you might have first turn, it could well be worth anticipating what's going to happen on maybe the next turn or so after that for your reserves unit. It might be particularly important for slow moving melee units like these Death Shroud Terminators for example. What happens if they say drop into that location and then they fail their charge initially and the opponent just backs away from them? Are you going to have a vast amount of power just basically out of the game for several turns? In some cases it just might not be worth dropping on the extreme flanks for that sort of thing, if it could give your opponent the big opportunity to basically ignore them and keep them out of the game until it no longer matters, even if maybe somewhere else could be a riskier drop. I'd also bear in mind that dropping in an isolated pocket in the enemy deployment zone could often be a bit of a trap for your unit. Say for example you put a scary Terminator squad down in the one gap that's big enough for them in the enemy drop zone. Maybe they manage to shoot a bunch of things dead, perhaps make a charge and deal some damage. But then on the turn after that, unless they've caused some absolutely massive damage, they might wind up being hit back hard. If you're dropping into the midst of the enemy army, then it means that they're just going to be able to deal a whole load of damage that they wouldn't normally be able to do. Perhaps a bunch of backfield units being able to shoot them when they would usually be hidden. Maybe units could line up for easy charges they wouldn't otherwise be able to get, plus everything in their firebase could potentially focus them if it needed to and send the best profiles their way. Even a big tough unit might potentially get hit back so hard and so easily that it wasn't really worth putting them there, and it might have been better just not taking the bait and going for a slightly slower game, maybe dropping them on a midfield objective as extra reinforcements and keeping them safe behind cover, so the opponent is forced to come to you and fight you on less favourable terms. Probably the most reliable way of delivering damage dealers from reserves, at least on the same turn, are shooting units, given that you know you'll get range on the opponent and get line of sight, whereas if you drop melee units in, they'll either have to make a risky charge or hope that they can survive the enemy doing a counter attack against them before they get to charge again. When coming in from reserve, you have to deploy just over 9 inches away from the enemy, and the over bit is kind of important, as it means that the minimum charge distance you need to roll will be a 9 on the 2d6 normally to get within that 1 inch engagement range. That means that under normal circumstances, just charging straight out of reserve is odds on to fail. A 9 inch charge has a 28% chance of success, boosted up to around about a 50-50 with a single command point reroll. That's definitely not awful odds, and sometimes it could well be worth it if it's going to be game changing or your unit is going to be at least okay to survive a bit of firepower, but it's very much not odds on. And it's one good reason why it's often best to try and get things into melee with rapid ingress out of reserves, which I'll touch on in a second. If you've got rules that give you a +1 to charge, say like Blood Angels with Dante, that boosts it up to 42% or 66% with a reroll, and if you have a +2 to your charge from something, it goes to 58% or 83% with a reroll. Anything with boosted charge rules does definitely give you a lot more reliability, but even 8 inches and a command reroll ready to be spent, it's still going to fail 1/3 of the time. You definitely have to plan for the possibility that your unit just sits there and doesn't move. Often it might make sense to drop them behind terrain or keep them kind of hidden from the rest of the enemy army if they do happen to fail. Bear in mind as well that even if your unit's a shooting unit, often it might be the best decision to drop them in, shoot at the enemy army a fair bit, and then follow up that firepower with a nuisance charge. That often can be a good decision for a unit that otherwise is probably just going to get shot down with absolute ease. Maybe things like Tempestus Scions, for example. Hopefully you want to charge something that won't actually outright kill them in the same turn, and you actually manage to hold them up in combat and disrupt them doing what they want to do otherwise. If you can contest or deny a primary objective at the same time, then all well and good. You might even do a little bit of damage with them unexpectedly as well. And between all that, sometimes that can be the right decision as opposed to just leaving them sitting there, having fired their guns and waiting for the strike back. Before we talk rapid ingress things, I thought I'd just touch on a few other types of reserve. One rule that's had a fair bit of proliferation in 10th edition have been 3-inch deep strikers, things like Inceptors, Tempestus Aquilons, and a good number of stratagems for different codexes. And these break the normal rules of deep strike by allowing your unit to just turn up right next to the enemy, which is massively powerful. They do have the restriction that they're unable to charge after, for kind of obvious reasons, as it'd just be utterly broken. The effect of reducing a 9-inch deep strike denial down to a 3-inch though is really quite huge. If the opponent absolutely maximises things, they can still deny them from some board locations, but it's not really going to be particularly practical to screen them out on a big level, and more or less such a unit will be going pretty much where it wants, often getting a behind-the-scenes pass to an enemy deployment zone if they want to. The stratagems and units that can use this often tend to be really high value within their codexes as a result. As mentioned, being able to drop into the enemy deployment zone basically guaranteed is just excellent for guaranteeing certain slightly harder to do tactical secondaries, things like established locus and behind enemy lines. If you've got a shooting unit with the 3-inch drop rule, it means that you can basically have some really precise damage on exactly where you need it in the opponent's army. Say if they've got some fragile damage dealers that are going to be hiding out of line of sight until they strike, you could potentially drop a 3-inch deep striker next to them and go to town with a bunch of shooting, or otherwise do the same to some lightly lower points cost but nonetheless crucial backfield objective grabbers, perhaps wipe off a squad of Chaos Cultists off a home field objective and replace it with your 3-inch deep strikers. Those two are maybe some of the most obvious ones, but you might also occasionally be able to sneak a primary objective. If the opponent's put a model just towing on to the very edge of the objective's control area, you might be able to land an entire 3-inch deep strike unit on the rest of that objective and take it directly for you, even if you can't slay that enemy model this turn. For big chunky units that can do this, like say Deathwing Terminators in their Inner Circle detachment, or Chaos Demons and Grey Knights full stop, you can use it to put an enormous amount of scary threat in one area of the board. Likely a bunch of these heavily armoured things will mainly want to charge to deal most of their damage, but it does give the opponent a massive problem of how they deal with a big Terminator squad or a Great Unclean one suddenly in their backfield. Do you divide and put a whole bunch of forces going back to try and sort them out and stop them taking your home objective? And even if they do that and are successful, it means they probably have a whole bunch of things out of position. You might even be able to block movement or charges in a pinch potentially. If the opponent's got some sort of ridiculously powerful Death Star unit that wants to be moving up the board, sacrificing a 3-inch drop unit might just occasionally be an absolutely game-winning move if it stops them from getting any further the next turn. Potentially a big melee Terminator Death Star being held back by a thin line of Tempestus Aquilons or Grey Knight Strike Squad that's chosen to get thoroughly in the way and keep them penned in their own deployment zone for a turn. All in all, these guys generally pay at least some sort of premium in reserves to get that rule, but they're often worth it for their different armies. Otherwise, for a few other different flavours of reserve units, one occasionally used tactic is to have some sort of character with a small base go into reserves, either deep striking or strategic reserve. Typically, characters don't tend to have amazing defense per point, even the tanky ones, but they might have the advantage of being able to get where other units just wouldn't be able to fit, maybe being able to fit in a tiny gap and get a crucial behind enemy lines from something like an Imperial Guard Commissar in strategic reserve, or jumping around Calidus Assassin, or a deep striking Terminator character like say Typhus running solo or Logan Grimnar going solo. The big chunky Terminator ones might also cause some problems of their own as well. Good saves, plenty of wounds and good invulnerable saves might not die even if you do shoot a bit of anti-tank at them, and they often have some fairly scary melee profiles if they do happen to survive their suicide mission. Return to reserve units often tend to be another really powerful option. Lots of squads have rules where they basically return into strategic reserve or just go off the board to return next reserve phase at the end of the enemy turn. So at the end of their turn you can basically look at the board state and see whether or not it's worth using any of those rules versus where they'll be able to move and do things otherwise. Basically these units can get around the reserve restrictions on not being able to bring things in on turn 4, turn 5, and that can be really big. Usually in those latter couple of turns of the game, it's a little bit less important about destroying enemy units, though still helpful enough if you can, but maybe more about actually getting points or denying them to your opponent, maybe destroying their backfield objective holders, doing secondary missions that need to be in the right places, and your normal turn 2 and turn 3 reserves are gone and done with at that point, maybe moving to threatened primaries, either a lightly defended far-flung midfield one perhaps, or again going for their home field. And also secret missions could be a consideration as well. Say for example battle line units getting into the enemy deployment zone and surviving there, if the opponents don't happen to have any battle line themselves. Finally, for slightly unusual classes of reserves, there's the drop then move units. A fair few units in the game have things that they can move X inches after shooting, and while 9th edition I believe had rules that stopped you moving after deep strike, 10th edition has no such restrictions, so it means that units like Tyranid Gargoyles, the Necron Chronomancer, and the Phobos Lieutenant for the Space Marines can potentially come in from reserves and then move d6 inches after firing, potentially being able to get to areas of the board that otherwise would be screens. It almost feels like it could be a slightly 3-inch drop light mode, for say if you need to get to one part of the board to do a secondary objective, or again they could be particularly handy for being able to contest certain primary objectives. Again, you might be able to drop them sort of close and then use that rule to be able to move up and contest or even take a primary in the right circumstances. It could just be nice for trying to keep the squad safe behind a ruin as well after they've done a bit of damage and the enemy's coming to strike back. Finally, and perhaps saving the best for last, let's talk about Rapid Ingress. This one's a 1 command point stratagem to arrive from reserves at the end of the enemy movement phase rather than yours. You can do it both with strategic reserve and with deep strike, and the primary purpose of it is often to try and arrive a unit close but safe, so the opponent isn't able to do anything about them when it comes to their shooting phase and charge phase, but then when it gets to your turn, they can get some very easy damage off, moving up and then shooting and charging. Perhaps for the most basic and obvious use, it's just great for setting up a charge. Say for example the Chaos player wants to arrive his Warp Talons from Deep Strike, the Space Marine player has just moved with their Repulsor Executioner and their Hellblasters here, and then the Chaos player's Rapid Ingress with the Warp Talons behind a line of sight blocking ruin, so neither of them can see them. You basically have perfect knowledge of exactly where the opponent's moved, so the movement phase is now over for them, and it means that you just know that they won't be able to get line of sight on those Warp Talons, otherwise you wouldn't have put them there. Then when it gets to your turn, the Warp Talons will be able to move 12 inches, and that should be enough to get a very, very close range charge off, potentially as little as a 2-inch one or something. And it means for 1 command point, you can basically near guarantee a charge if you've got the right terrain there to shield you and your opponent's army is in the right sort of formation. But there can be a bit of counterplay to it, maybe using lighter units to try and screen it out for your scariest units. In general, it is just pretty massively powerful. As well as getting close range melee off, you'll be able to use shooting units at really close range. That can be quite big for things like Eradicators with their melter guns. Very nice to be able to get them within 9 inches if you can, with say Uriel Ventress deep striking them or something. It does often work better if you're going second rather than going first though, as it means that you can trigger it in the opponent's turn 2, so you can have your unit active in your turn 2 rather than your turn 3. And otherwise, bear in mind it does have some downsides. A fair few reserve special abilities state that they only happen when a unit arrives from reserves in your own reinforcement phase, so don't combo with it. And it can be an active negative if used badly. Some units might have the durability where they can just land right out in the open and tank a little bit of enemy firepower and still be able to get that close charge off. But I guess what you really don't want to do is just have a big important unit show up in the enemy's turn, but you've just wound up exposing them to an entire turn worth of enemy firepower and they just shoot them down. So you both lose a valuable unit of reserves and also a command point. That's what not to do. Rapid Ingress is worth considering for a bunch of other uses though. Potentially, if there's just some completely uncontested primary objectives in the midfield, you might be able to throw a reserves unit there, so that when it gets to your turn, you'll be able to score that in your command phase. That might tend to be a little bit on the rare side though, if you haven't chosen to move units up to that objective and nor has your opponent. And you also might be able to do some big brain plays with defending units that are clearly just about to be charged by something scary of the enemy, maybe having a whole bunch of Flamers of Tzeentch arriving from Rapid Ingress and then threatening to overwatch the thing that's about to charge, or having some sort of enormous melee Death Star unit turn up right next to a unit that's about to be charged, or ready to use heroic intervention if the enemy does decide to go for it. Unless you've got some sort of free stratagem option in the unit though, that could be a very pricey option, costing a big 2 command points to pull off. Potentially you can get some very strange things going on if you also have 3-inch deep strike on a unit as well. For example, you could maybe rapid ingress a unit just 3 inches in front of an enemy unit that was just about to charge and then completely block their charge to the thing that they wanted to get to. Certainly sacrificing a unit, but occasionally that could be worth it if the one just behind it was absolutely critical to the game plan in some way. In any case though, I'll leave that there for now. Let me know your thoughts on using reserves in Warhammer 40k, how have you best managed to get advantages from it from your own army, and let me know any other uses I might have missed in this one. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.